And what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about hormone actions and the hypothalamic pituitary axis. The first part of the lecture is going to talk about G-protein coupled receptors, often known as GPCRs. The major idea of point one, is that we have communication across a phospholipid bilayer. We're going to talk about hormones that are peptide hormones or protein hormones and how they manage to communicate to the inside of the cell. There are a number of these, and there are several different ones that we could talk about. We've chosen here to talk about the G-protein coupled receptors because they're by far and away the most common. One of the major ideas that will fall out of this as well is that it's not about the hormone, it's about the receptor. It turns out that some 4% of your genome is dedicated to making these transmembrane proteins, these G-protein coupled receptors. What you want to remember about the G-protein coupled receptors is they are transmembrane proteins, and they do a classic thing that hormone receptors do. They're going to affect enzyme activity. The enzyme activity we're going to talk about is something known as adenylyl cyclase. Adenylyl cyclase is a really, really important enzyme in all of our cells. And what it does is it converts garden variety adenosine triphosphate to cyclic AMP. The cyclic AMP now becomes a messenger. Cyclic AMP then can go activate all manner of different enzymes and do all of those things that we think about when we think about what hormones do inside cells. That is, they can change the activity of enzymes, they can change the activity of channels, they can change exocytosis and endocytosis, and they can affect gene transcription and translation. So all of that, and usually, not always, but usually starts from the G-protein coupled receptors through adenylyl cyclase. And so we'll talk about this particular enzyme activity. But hold in your head the idea that the G-protein coupled receptors are communicating across a phospholipid bilayer by binding a molecule on the outside and generating conformational change on the inside of the protein, on the cytoplasmic side of the protein. Then we're going to jump to the idea of steroid hormones and their receptors. Steroid hormones are hydrophobic hormones. All the steroid hormones are based on cholesterol. They're derivatives of cholesterol, and cholesterol is a hydrophobic molecule. As a hydrophobic molecule, it is water insoluble but lipid soluble. So what this means then is the steroid hormones, because they're hydrophobic, can easily pass through the phospholipid bilayer. That's in contrast to these great big peptides and proteins. Here we have a molecule that zips right through the membrane, goes on the inside of the cell. But now once it's on the inside of the cell, it binds to a receptor. We're then going to talk a little bit about these receptors, where up here, these are transmembrane protein receptors, these are cytoplasmic receptors. So they're actually in the cytoplasm. So once the hormone is in the cytoplasm, it can bind to these hormones. Once the hormone is inside the cytoplasm, it can bind to these hormone receptors. Now, one of the hallmarks of these steroid hormone receptors is that they are a transcription factor. What this means, going back to the early days of talking about DNA, a transcription factor means that we're going to aggregate a series of proteins on a promoter, one of the Tata boxes. And that can then generate gene transcription. So what we're talking about with these steroid hormones is they slither across the phospholipid bilayer, they bind to cytoplasmic receptors, and these cytoplasmic receptors then can make their way to the nucleus where they turn on genes, they bind to DNA. So although an action of all hormones is to turn on genes, this one is truly gene transcription and translation. It functions predominantly through gene transcription and translation. These are hydrophobic hormones into the cytoplasm, and we'll talk about the characteristics of their receptor, which allow them to get into the nucleus. Then once we've gotten these generic terms down and these broad sweeps of how hormones function, then we're going to talk about something called the hypothalamic pituitary axis. This is an idea we're going to come back to over and over again, particularly when we get to reproduction. You really need to understand this hypothalamic pituitary axis. But there's some general rules here about how hormones function that we've talked about before that we can apply to this story. Hypothalamic tells you it's part of the brain. The pituitary is, in fact, we'll see, a separate set of cells, has a different origin. But having said that, the pituitary itself is divided into two regions. The posterior pituitary, and I want you to remember this, the posterior pituitary is an extension of the hypothalamus. So the posterior pituitary is part of the brain. There will be neurons that extend from the brain into the posterior pituitary and release hormones from those neurons directly into the blood. There are only two hormones that do this. One is vasopressin and the other is oxytocin. Both vasopressin and oxytocin are released from neurons directly into the blood. Both vasopressin and oxytocin are peptide hormones. Both of these now have to bind to transmembrane protein receptors to affect an action. These guys are very similar. They're only a couple of amino acids different. But now separate you're thinking of the posterior pituitary from the anterior pituitary. Where the posterior pituitary is an extension of the brain, the anterior pituitary has originated as something known as Rathke's pouch. Now, the name isn't important, but it's important to recognize that the Rathke's pouch was originally epithelial cells. And it's migrated from its original development in the pharynx and moved from the pharynx and tucked itself. The migration of these cells tuck themselves up beneath the hypothalamus and next door to the posterior pituitary. But they are mechanically separate from the brain. And the only communication between cells in the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus is through something known as the portal blood supply. In other words, all the blood that goes to the anterior pituitary first passes through the hypothalamus. And there will be neurons in the hypothalamus that release peptide hormones called releasing hormones. Those releasing hormones enter the portal blood supply, and the only place they're going is to the anterior pituitary. So they're then these releasing hormones are going to leave the hypothalamus in the blood and go to the anterior pituitary, where there are separate cells, specialized cells in the anterior pituitary called troph cells. The troph cells bind to the releasing hormone, and they then release stimulating hormones that go out to the target. And we'll talk about this cascade of events. And then finally is the concept, a really, really important concept in biology, of negative feedback. That is, the generation, the production, the secretion of hormones to the target gland are going to feed back onto the releasing cells in the hypothalamus and back onto the troph cells in the anterior pituitary and throttle back their production of their requisite hormone. And that's the control system. It's a feedback system. And we'll talk a little bit about that.